The human being has always been a species on the move. You go back to our own evolution, we sort of populated the earth. Movement is a lot easier now, and people wind up going everywhere. You're a sending country, you are a receiving country at the same time. You can't categorize the flow of people as strictly migrants or refugees. And I think the other important piece of this is that as one crisis takes precedence, the other older crises remain unresolved, unloved, underfunded, and waiting, in a sense, to burst back onto the scene in ways that we would rather not have happen. Right now, there are approximately 4 million Syrians internally displaced within the country, people who have had to leave because of violence. There are another at least 4 million Syrians outside of the country who are refugees. As you can tell, we've been reading all about this phenomenon of people moving to Europe. Over the past year plus, it's been about 1.2 million people, about 60% of whom are Syrians. But if you look at these big circles, you will realize that the majority of Syrian refugees are actually not in Europe, in spite of what people would have us believe. As a matter of fact, Germany has received a little under 500,000 applicants for asylum, and that's the largest country in Europe in terms of this. 2.7 million in Turkey, a little over 1 million in Lebanon, 600,000 plus in Jordan, large numbers in Iraq and Egypt as well. To put this in context, 1 in 4 people in Lebanon right now is a Syrian refugee. If Germany accepted 2 million Syrians, 1 in 40 would be a Syrian refugee, and they are nowhere close to that, nor will they ever get close to that. So the burden of this is not being borne by Europe. The burden is being borne by the, relatively speaking, poor countries surrounding Syria. And it is a burden. That many of the children who, in a sense, have left Syria or are now finally leaving Syria have had sketchy school for the last 3, 4, 5 years. One of the real challenges that we are dealing with in terms of our educational efforts for children is having classrooms of children with huge age gaps, because some of them have literally not been in school since the war broke out. One of the things we are doing in Lebanon is specifically working with Syrian children, preparing them to enter the Lebanese school system. To enter the school system there, you need to have functional English and French. So we have set up these sort of year-long programs to get students ready for the Lebanese school system. At each of our centers, in addition to the education that we do, there is also a social worker. And she or he, in a sense, deals with the children who act out. But any of you who have taught school before know that when you meet the kid's parents, you understand why the kid is the way he is, or she is. And so these social workers also do psychosocial interventions with families. A lot of trauma in these families that children are doing their best to deal with. Darfur happened, or the sort of the peak of it when it hit our imaginations was 2003. That's 12, 13 years back. The average stay in a refugee camp is 17 years. These folks are not going back to Sudan in the near conceivable future. They are still in camps. What do you do? What does JRS want to do? Well, fundamentally, we want to educate. We want to provide people with opportunities to make something different happen in their lives. United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees are the primary funding agency for things like education and health and food in these camps. JRS is the largest provider of education in these camps, and with 2 weeks' notice, we learned that as of January 1st, our education budget was cut by 42%. Now, I don't blame UNHCR for this. They're being called to that situation that we just saw, and the needs in the Middle East are great. They beg money from governments like yours and mine and the rest of the world, but the responses don't match the needs. So what's basically happening throughout the world is these old crises, like Darfur and Chad, get cut because the new crisis demands all of the attention. We're in negotiations with UNHCR right now to figure out what that final number will be. By statute, they have to provide primary education. Frankly, JRS is already the lowest cost provider, so we will ultimately work something out with them. But let's just get a picture of what happens if you don't do education in Chad. 8-year-olds who need education are cute. 14-year-olds who need education are not cute. What happens when there is no high school? What happens when there is nothing to structure their days? Specifically in Chad, the boys typically wind up going north to work in the mines on the Chadian, Libyan, Algerian border. This is very hard work. They typically don't stay long. They raise enough money to keep going north to Libya, and going back to that first map we saw, move towards Europe. And because they aren't educated, and because there's not a lot of hope, they run into the sort of people who we know others have been running into in Europe. And the radicalized Muslim is one possibility. For the girls, the two options are different, but not necessarily better. Early marriage tends to happen. If a girl is sitting around not doing much, she's marriageable. Or frankly, I think the most accurate term is, I would call it, survival sex. That's what happens to girls who don't have a future. So I would maintain that if we're looking at this as a global issue, it's better to deal with the situation where people are than wait for them to be in problems or to cause problems wherever they might wind up. The two largest groups that we work with in Bangkok are Somalis. A lot of Somali youth somehow wind up there, helping them get into the idea of being able to care for themselves. The other large group are Pakistanis. And Thailand had long been the sort of exit valve for problems in Pakistan. Some would be considered more economic migrants. Some, I would say, definitely have a claim for refugees. We met, when I was there, we met with a woman, her 4 children. Her husband was out working. Her name was Amaya. She and her husband had fled because she's Christian. And her job in Pakistan was giving polio vaccines in rural areas. You know, those old sugar drops that many of us got when we were kids. Well, the radicalized Muslims in the area thought she was giving birth control to the population, so they basically said, you stop doing this or we will take care of you. And she and her husband did not believe that if they stopped it, they wouldn't be taken care of. So off to Thailand they go. So we met her and her children. They had been in Thailand at that point for about 6 months. One of the agencies that JRS works with had helped them find some place. JRS does a lot of visits with folks. And she was very happy that she had just received her appointment with UNHCR to get her refugee status. So UNHCR needs to declare you to be a bona fide refugee. And then in this case, they hope to be resettled to a place like Canada or the US, another country that would take them. She was very happy that she had received an appointment for their meeting, which was going to be in July 2019. 3 years plus of suspended animation. Then perhaps a statement of being a refugee, and then an indeterminate period of waiting for resettlement. The budget was cut there. UNHCR's budget was cut there as well. Appointments that used to take a year now take 3 years. The resettlement process, which used to take maybe 3 to 4 years, will at least take 6 to 8 years. What that does to a family, what that does to people in limbo, what that does to people who don't get refugee status and have to go back, you can add up that picture in your own mind. Being a Jesuit operation, we've always taken education seriously. And we were very moved by Pope Francis' call for the Year of Mercy. And basically, we asked ourselves, how does JRS respond to the Year of Mercy? And our decision was to, in a sense, double down or really go all in for education for refugees. Why? I think you can piece together why education is so important. If people are staying in camps for 17 years on average, something has to happen during that time to make a difference. If you're going to be in no man's land or no woman's land in Thailand for 6, 7, 8 years, we need to be doing something with our lives to prepare for what comes next. If we don't want kids to become child soldiers, or child brides, or child sex survivors, education is the way to do that. So in a sense, we have responded to the Pope by saying JRS is going to use education as our lens. We're running a campaign called Mercy in Motion, putting our mercy in motion, inviting others to put mercy in motion with us, with 3 features. Focusing on the education of those most in need. Our experiences, that's typically youth. As I mentioned, UNHCR has to provide primary education. That's where we want to help. The second piece is to do teacher training. The studies tell us that well-trained teachers do a much better job of educating their students, especially when the classrooms have 40, 50, 60, 90 kids in them. And finally, JRS has a small higher education project working with refugees, because less than 1% of refugees have the opportunity for higher education. We want to try and expand this where we can and really tie that education into outcomes that make a difference for refugees. One of the things that I'm most interested in is, can we create a digital version of normal schools, creating teachers out of these programs who meet the requirements in the local area, can get jobs, make a difference for their families, lift the boats of everybody who's in the educational system where they are. That's what we are trying to do in terms of responding to this crisis. Whatever happens, once someone is educated, they carry that with them. They don't have to pack it up. It's always part of their lives. It's something which can make a difference. And that's what I think we are ultimately trying to do in this crisis, is to realize that it is indeed global, to realize our temptations are to be fearful, but that's not where we will find Jesus, and to make contributions, to make interventions, to walk with people in ways that help them, that empower them to do what they need to do for their futures.